When my wife filed for divorce last August, I was destroyed. When my wife filed for divorce last August, it felt as though the ground beneath me crumbled in an instant. I remember the envelope lying on the dining table, its stark white glaring against the dark wood. It was a small object, but it carried a weight that crushed me. Even before I opened it, I knew what it was. Something in the way she'd been acting cold, distant, preoccupied had been leading to this moment, though I had done everything in my power to ignore the signs. For days after receiving the papers, I moved through life in a fog. I went to work, answered emails, and performed the bare minimum of my responsibilities, but inside, I was empty. Every corner of the house was a reminder of what we had shared. The sofa still bore the faint imprint of her favorite spot. The coffee mug with her initials sat on the kitchen counter, as if mocking me with its permanence in a world that was rapidly unraveling. I couldn't understand how it had come to this. We'd been married for 9 years, nearly a decade of shared laughter, arguments, compromises, and dreams. Or at least, that's how I saw it. In hindsight, the cracks had started appearing long before August. They were subtle at first: missed dinners, a lack of eye contact, conversations that grew shorter and more superficial. I thought it was just the ebb and flow of a marriage, the natural dip that comes when life's stressors pile up. But now, in the stark clarity of hindsight, I could see the truth. I had ignored her unhappiness for too long. I had told myself that her quiet discontent was temporary, that she would come around, that the warmth would return if I just gave her space. What I hadn't realized was that the space I gave her had widened into a chasm, one I'd been too blind or too afraid to bridge. The first few weeks after the filing were a spiral of self-destruction. I stopped eating properly, surviving on coffee and takeout that I barely touched. Sleep became an elusive ghost, and when it did come, it was riddled with dreams that left me more exhausted than when I'd closed my eyes. Friends reached out, but their words of comfort felt hollow. How could they understand the depth of my failure? How could anyone? In the rare moments I allowed myself to feel something beyond despair, anger bubbled up. I was furious with her for giving up, for not trying harder, for walking away from the life we'd built. But even that anger couldn't sustain itself, quickly dissolving into guilt. Deep down, I knew I had played my part in this unraveling. I had let work consume me, allowed my attention to drift from the small moments that mattered. I had stopped showing her that she was my priority. The weekends were the hardest. Without the structure of work to distract me, I found myself pacing the house like a ghost, picking up objects that once had meaning: a photo from our honeymoon, the first book we'd bought for our shared library. Each item was a reminder of a life that no longer existed. I spent hours scrolling through old photos, my chest tightening with every image of us smiling, holding hands, unaware of what the future held. One Saturday, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at the closet. Her side was empty now, the hangers swinging slightly as if taunting me with their emptiness. It was the physical embodiment of her absence, and for the first time since receiving the papers, I broke down. The sobs came in waves, uncontrollable and raw, each one tearing through me like a storm. I sank to the floor, clutching the edge of the bed as if it could anchor me to the life I'd lost. Eventually, the storm passed, leaving me hollow but strangely calm. It was in that emptiness that I realized something: I couldn't keep living like this. The divorce wasn't just a death, it was also a reckoning. It forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd been avoiding for years, the parts that had contributed to the slow erosion of our marriage. I started therapy, though it took weeks to muster the courage to make the first appointment. Sitting in that chair, recounting my failures to a stranger, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I allowed myself to unpack the emotions I'd been burying: shame, regret, and a deep, aching loneliness that had been present long before the divorce. As the months passed, I began to find small moments of clarity. I started journaling, spilling my thoughts onto the page in an attempt to make sense of them. I reconnected with old friends, admitting to them how lost I felt. To my surprise, they didn't judge me, they simply listened, offering their presence without expecting me to be okay. It was a kindness I hadn't realized I needed. The house, once a prison of memories, began to feel less suffocating. I rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and even started a small garden in the backyard. It wasn't about erasing her presence, it was about reclaiming the space as my own. Each small change felt like a step toward healing, a reminder that life could continue, even if it looked different now. It's been over a year since that August, and while the pain hasn't completely faded, it's no longer the all-consuming force it once was. I still think about her, about us every day. But I'm learning to let go of the what-ifs and if-onlys. They no longer have the power to control me. The man I am now is not the same man who sat staring at that envelope last year. I'm still a work in progress, still figuring out what my life looks like without her. But I'm learning to forgive myself, to accept the parts of me that faltered, and to find meaning in the lessons this loss has taught me. And while I may never fully heal, I know one thing for certain: I survived. And sometimes, survival is its own kind of victory. As the years stretched on, the ache of her absence dulled, not vanishing but settling into a quieter place in my mind. Grief became a companion rather than a tormentor, a presence I acknowledged but no longer let control me. I began to understand that healing wasn't a straight line or a finish line to cross, it was a winding path with no set destination. Some days I felt strong, almost invincible, and others I found myself crumbling over the smallest triggers: a song on the radio, a whiff of her favorite perfume as I passed someone in a crowd. But amidst the pain, there were moments of growth, glimmers of something new trying to break through the rubble of my old life. Therapy had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, truths I had spent years avoiding. I came to see how much of my identity I had tied to the roles I played: husband, provider, protector, and how little attention I had given to who I was beneath them. For so long, I had measured my worth by external standards, by what I could give or achieve, and when those were stripped away, I was left with a version of myself I barely recognized. Slowly, I started piecing together a new identity. I took up hobbies I'd always dismissed as not having time: for cooking, hiking, even sketching. The first few attempts were awkward and frustrating, but with time, I found a strange joy in the process of creating something for no one but myself. It was a small rebellion against the perfectionism that had ruled my life for so long. The garden in my backyard became a sanctuary. What started as a half-hearted attempt to fill my empty weekends turned into a daily ritual. I planted flowers and vegetables, nurturing them with a care I hadn't realized I was capable of. Watching them grow became a metaphor for my own journey, a reminder that change takes time, patience, and persistence. I also reconnected with people I had neglected during my marriage: friends and family I had let drift away in the chaos of life. At first, the conversations were awkward, filled with tentative questions and careful avoidance of the subject of my divorce. But as time went on, I found comfort in their presence, in their willingness to stand by me even when I felt like I had nothing to offer in return. Their support reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I had convinced myself I was. One unexpected turning point came when I received an email from my ex-wife. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic, just a short message thanking me for signing the divorce papers and wishing me well, but it was enough to stir a cascade of emotions I hadn't fully dealt with. Reading her words, I realized that I didn't hate her, and maybe I never truly had. What I had hated was the loss of the life we'd built, the way it had all slipped through my fingers. But now, for the first time, I felt a sliver of gratitude. Gratitude for the good years we'd shared, and for the lessons her departure had forced me to learn. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened it, allowing me to see our marriage and its end with more clarity. I began to accept that not every story is meant to last forever, and that didn't mean it hadn't been meaningful. Letting go didn't mean forgetting, it meant making peace with the past and allowing myself to move forward. As the seasons changed and the one-year mark of our divorce approached, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. My life still wasn't perfect, far from it. I still wrestled with insecurities, still faced moments of doubt and loneliness, but there was a resilience in me now that hadn't existed before. I had faced my darkest moments and come out the other side, not unscathed but stronger in ways I hadn't anticipated. The house, once a museum of memories, had transformed into a home that felt like mine. The garden was in full bloom, a riot of colors and scents that filled the air with life. My career, which I'd neglected during the early months of my grief, was thriving again, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because I had rediscovered a passion for what I did. Most importantly, I had rediscovered myself. The version of me that had been buried under years of roles and expectations was finally coming to light, imperfect, vulnerable, and still figuring things out, but undeniably me. On the anniversary of the day she filed for divorce, I didn't mourn. Instead, I spent the day tending to my garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the yard, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The pain of losing her would never fully disappear, and I was okay with that. It was a part of my story, a chapter that had shaped me in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. But it was just one chapter, not the whole book. For the first time, I felt ready to turn the page and see what the next one held. In the days that followed the anniversary, I noticed a change in how I approached my life. There was a stillness in my mind, an acceptance that allowed me to be present in ways I hadn't been for years. The relentless need to dwell on what could have been faded, replaced by a quiet determination to focus on what could be. I began setting small, achievable goals for myself, not grand resolutions but meaningful steps. I signed up for a local photography class, something I had always been curious about but never made time for. At first, I felt out of place, surrounded by strangers who seemed far more skilled and confident, but as the weeks went on, I started to find joy in the process of capturing life through a lens. Photography became an unexpected outlet for emotions I struggled to articulate, a way to frame my world and see it in a new light. My relationship with my family also deepened. For years, I had been distant, too consumed by the demands of marriage and work to truly connect with them. Now, I made an effort to call my parents regularly, to visit my sister and her kids. Spending time with them reminded me of the unconditional love that had always been there, even when I didn't feel deserving of it. My nieces and nephews, with their boundless energy and unfiltered joy, became a source of unexpected comfort, their laughter a balm for the parts of me still healing. One particularly poignant moment came during a visit to my sister's house. Her youngest daughter, barely 6 years old, handed me a drawing she had made, a colorful sketch of a garden with flowers blooming wildly under a bright sun. In her childish scrawl, she had written, "Uncle, I love your garden. It's happy." I held back tears as I hugged her, struck by how something as simple as planting flowers had become a symbol of renewal, not just for me but for those around me. As I continued to rebuild, I also began to confront the parts of myself I had ignored for too long. Therapy became less about unpacking my grief and more about exploring who I wanted to be moving forward. I started journaling about my values, my dreams, and the kind of life I wanted to create. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future without the shadow of my failed marriage looming over it. The process wasn't linear. There were still days when the weight of everything hit me all at once, days when I couldn't help but revisit the moments that had led to the divorce, wondering if I could have done more, been more. But those days were fewer now, and they didn't hold the same power over me. I learned to acknowledge the pain without letting it consume me, to accept that some questions would never have answers, and that it was okay to move forward anyway. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I came across a stack of photos from our early years together. There we were, laughing at the beach, celebrating birthdays, holding hands at a wedding. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the bittersweet tug of those memories, the warmth of what we had shared mingling with the ache of its loss. But instead of spiraling into regret, I felt a sense of gratitude. Those moments, though fleeting, were real. They had shaped me, taught me, and, in their own way, prepared me for the life I was now building. As the year drew to a close, I decided to take a leap I never would have considered before. I booked a solo trip to a small coastal town I had always wanted to visit but had kept putting off. The idea of traveling alone was daunting, but it also felt like a challenge I was ready to face. Walking along the quiet beaches, watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't experienced in years. The solitude wasn't lonely, it was empowering. One morning during that trip, as I watched the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by what I had lost. My identity wasn't tied to my marriage or my divorce, it was something I was creating, day by day, choice by choice. The man who had been shattered by those divorce papers last August was still a part of me, but he wasn't all of me. I had grown, transformed, and begun to embrace a version of myself that I never thought possible. By the time I returned home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The life I was building wasn't perfect, and it didn't need to be. It was mine, and that was enough. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and struggle, but I also knew I had the strength to face them. I had survived the worst, and in doing so, I had discovered a resilience that would carry me forward. Looking out at my garden, now vibrant and full of life, I felt a deep sense of peace. The flowers didn't bloom overnight, and neither had I, but with time, care, and patience, both had flourished. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of joy once more. As the weeks passed after my solo trip, the lessons I'd learned began to ripple outward into every aspect of my life. My days felt fuller, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was choosing to fill them with things that mattered. I embraced a slower, more intentional rhythm, one that allowed me to savor the moments I'd once rushed through without a second thought. I began volunteering at a local community center. Initially, I joined to give myself something to do on weekends, but it quickly became a highlight of my week. I worked with kids from underprivileged backgrounds, helping them with homework and creative projects. Their resilience and curiosity were inspiring, and their laughter reminded me of something I had almost forgotten: how joy could spring from the simplest things. Through this work, I met people who carried their own stories of struggle and triumph, individuals who had faced adversity far greater than my own and had emerged stronger. Their courage gave me perspective, and their kindness reminded me of the power of human connection. For so long, I had closed myself off, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness. I saw it as a strength, a way to bridge the gap between ourselves and others. My relationship with my ex-wife also took on a new shape. Though we hadn't spoken much in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, we began to communicate sporadically, texts to check in, the occasional email about shared logistics. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was civil, even kind. I could sense that she was healing in her own way, just as I was. And though I couldn't say for sure, I hoped she had found some semblance of peace. One evening, as I sorted through old belongings, I came across a journal I had started years ago but abandoned after just a few entries. Flipping through its pages, I saw the musings of a younger version of myself, a man full of dreams and ambitions, yet uncertain and hesitant. Reading those words, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow for the person I had been, but also pride for how far I had come. I decided to start writing again, using the journal not just as a record of my thoughts but as a tool for growth. Writing became a nightly ritual, a way to process the day's events and reflect on the changes I was experiencing. Through those pages, I explored my fears, my hopes, and the lingering wounds I was still working to heal. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes the words refused to come, and other times they spilled out in a torrent I could barely keep up with. But the act of writing itself was cathartic, a reminder that my story was still unfolding. As the anniversary of my divorce approached again, I found myself reflecting on the person I had become over the past 2 years. The man who had once felt broken and directionless now stood on steadier ground. I wasn't defined by my pain anymore. Instead, I was defined by my resilience, my willingness to confront the darkness and emerge into the light. I threw myself a small celebration that evening, not to mark the divorce, but to honor my growth. I invited a few friends over, People who had supported me through the toughest times, and we spent the night laughing, sharing stories, and toasting to new beginnings. The warmth and camaraderie reminded me of the importance of surrounding myself with people who lifted me up, who saw the best in me even when I struggled to see it in myself. As the night wound down and the guests left, I stood alone in my garden, the moon casting a soft glow over the flowers I had tended so carefully. The air was cool and still, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I didn't have all the answers, and I probably never would, but I had found a sense of balance, a foundation to build on. Life would continue to throw challenges my way, I knew that. But I also knew that I had the tools to face them, the strength to persevere, and the capacity to find beauty even in the midst of struggle. My marriage had been a chapter of my life, an important one, but it wasn't the whole story. The pages ahead were blank, waiting to be written, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to write them.